Welcome to On Point. I'm Sandy Chavez. Today we're talking about young voters. Registration is at an all-time high in California with 19 million people registered to vote. The Pew Research Center says next year millennials will outnumber baby boomers in the voting electorate, but only half of millennials typically turn out. Older voters have a 10% higher turnout rate. As the number of baby boomers decrease, 10 million fewer will be voting this year. The result of this coming election will depend on young voters. Some CSUN students say they'll be voting.
We need our votes to change this country, and a lot of people don't think it's important to vote, but it's really important.
I'm not a registered voter because, to be honest, no matter who wins the election, America's just going to be the country it is. You know, last election people thought they wanted change to the country, but no change has happened, and we've seen a lot of rhetoric and divisiveness come out of the current president we have. I'm not trying to be too political, but that's all we see today.
I haven't really been pressured that much by people, and it's just people are like, "Oh, you're 18, you can vote now." I'm like, "All right, that's cool." You know, I haven't really heard how good it is. I also haven't heard how bad it is either. So,
some celebrities are trying to get younger audiences to vote. 2 weeks ago, Taylor Swift posted her voting choices, giving young adults a link to register. Vote.org says over 100,000 young voters registered after Swift's post. Other celebrities like Kanye West are vocal about their support for President Trump. Here's what some CSUN students had to say.
Celebrities, they want to get young people to vote because a lot of young people like a lot of celebrities nowadays, so they feel like if that celebrity has a voice, I could follow their footsteps.
They should share their opinion because I believe everybody has their own opinion. It's freedom of speech.
Pew says less than a quarter of eligible millennials voted during the last midterms. Young people have been more likely to engage in political activism since 2016. The question is, will this activism make it to the polls? On Point's Akkaoui has more on the story.
Thank you, Sandy. I'd like to welcome my guests here today. First, we have CSUN political science professor Tyler Hughes and Associate Students Chair of Community and Government Relations, Tracy Johnson. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to dive right into it. First, what do you think discourages young people from voting?
That is a pretty big question. And I would say that it's less about discouraging and more about things that younger people have to overcome that they are more easily overcome later on in life. So there's a lot of things that correlate to whether or not people vote. Things like income and education, and age is one of those, as you mentioned. The older you get, the more likely you are to vote. But those things are all kind of interrelated. The older you get, the more money you have. The older you get, the more education you have. It also means that you have more free time. You can more easily access information. You can process information better. And those are all things that we know relate to voting. And as an 18 or a 20-year-old, you may not know much about the process. You may not know how to find information about the process. You may not know how to do things like register. You also maybe haven't been affected by a lot of policies in the way that older Americans have, so you're not as connected to the process. So there are a lot of things that cause voter turnout among younger citizens to be a little bit lower than the rest of the population.
How do you feel about that, Tracy?
When you say discouraged, I think of just barriers, right? And then you have the institutional barriers, and you've got psychological barriers. The institutional barriers being just the cost, the time it takes for you to spend. There's a cost that you pay in time, a cost that you pay in money. It costs money to go to the polls. It takes time to fill out the registration. And in this busy life these days, the cost isn't justified by the benefit. Because the benefits are, well, there's different kinds of benefits, but the likelihood of your vote mattering and changing, lowering taxes or getting you a job is rare. The psychological benefits of participating in it and the camaraderie, that what they call solidary benefits, are more rewarding than the tax cut that might get it. But so the institutional barriers are something that really, I think, can discourage. California's done a lot to reduce those barriers, to make voter registration easier. When you get a driver's license, you're automatically registered. Being able to register the same day as voting, but with a provisional ballot, these lower the costs of the institutional barriers. But the psychological barriers are like efficacy, like believing that this matters, that it's going to make a difference. The voter education, the knowledge, the trust in government, these things are barriers that can discourage young voters. But specifically, like Dr. Hughes was saying about people who have more experience with the policy and with the system aren't, you would think they might be discouraged, but they know how it works, and whereas the other end is just like this, maybe they come into it thinking this isn't going to work.
Yeah. Well, so how do you, I mean, we'll go with Tyler first. Do you think that nurturing, voting habits, do you think that should be a school's responsibility, or do you think that, it should be handled at home?
Yes, both. And we know that the amount of politics you talk about in your home when you're growing up, that socializes you to be more engaged in the process later on in life. So that's important. So if you grow, I grew up in an apolitical household. You don't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table in my household. I'm a political science professor now, so I sort of buck that trend. But generally, if you talk a lot of politics at home, you're more likely to be an active participant later on in life. So I think there is something to that in terms of your household, how you're nurtured there and socialized. In terms of school's responsibility, what I would say is that I see my job, especially as somebody who teaches like Polls 155, which is a class a lot of people take on campus, is that I want to empower you with the knowledge to participate and give you the tools to participate. That decision's up to you, but we should at least be giving students the resources they need in order to engage in the process, certainly not telling them how they should participate, but more generally how you can participate in the process. I think that is an important responsibility, especially for a public institution like the CSU system.
Okay. So with Tracy, so classes like government and economics aren't really, they aren't required in all states. 31 states require only one semester, 9 require a full year, and 10 don't require it at all. Do you think it has an effect on informing young voters?
Where does California fall into that? I hope that we...
in the CSU, we were required to take a course like Polls 155, for example, American Political Institutions.
No, absolutely. Really, and it was, Dr. Hughes was talking about like instilling this idea at home. It starts where they realize it's important. Civics classes in high schools. That is so important, I think, to give them a sense of how this works and a sense of, the ability to be involved and interact with the system, to participate in the system, should be available to them at a very early age. Economics, I started studying political science because I thought, you understand the world, but then I realized if you understand economics, you might even understand politics better. I don't want to say that in the presence of, a political science professor, but
it's a multidisciplinary approach.
There you go. But economics is vital to understanding what's going on. I mean, history, economics, and political science, these things go hand in hand, and they should be, absolutely, I think they should be taught at a very young age. It's probably a little complicated for, too low in high school, but I think it should be done in high school, not even just at college.
Yes, I believe in California, seniors are required to take government one semester and economics another semester. So, we're one of the 9 states in the United States that requires you to take it. So how do you feel about, being someone who, educates young adults in that subject? How do you see that, that statistic of, the states that require it versus that don't?
So first of all, I'm coming from a particular place because I'm a political science professor, so of course I think we should have more political science courses taught, right? But I do agree that there is a certain responsibility we have to, even if it's not engaging people in the process, explaining what your rights are as a citizen, or explaining how the government institutions around you function, or how our Constitution's built and structured. Those basic fundamental things about your everyday life are important, and they're just as important as other courses we require, and that we should require, and that students should get a large variety of those. But I would say it's unfortunate that more states don't require something like California does.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure a semester is enough. I mean, we come out of high school thinking, I have a right to this, I have a right to that, when it's like maybe a little bit more clarification might have been in order, because some people just have this idea that they have a right to things that maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. So one semester is cool, but it's also something about teaching them so far and not taking them all the way that could be I'm not saying don't teach them at all, but like we need to follow through on the whole thing rather than just false start on it kind of thing.
So Tracy, let's go into the event that you had on Monday. So associate students had the big politics on Monday. Tell us a little bit about the event and kind of the turnout of students that you got to the event.
Well, I'm glad to hear you heard about that. That means it was fairly successful. Big politics is something we've been planning for the last couple of months. My lobby corps committee and voter registration committee, we spent the last couple of months preparing everything for that. And Associated Students, like you said about what should a school do, well, Associated Students thinks is registering students to vote is important. And it's not a nonpartisan thing. It's not about who you're going to vote for, but making sure that they know it's important and that it's here for them, whether they do it or not. We gave away 500 hamburgers from the Habit Burger truck, and we had, I think, about 8 organizations came out and tabled. We quizzed students and we asked them questions like, who's the governor of California? Which party runs the Senate? Name 3 chief justices.
How'd they do? Was it good?
There was a lot of people who bombed it, and we had 2 10-question quizzes so that we could mix it up. There were some people who aced both of them and wanted to take it all, so it was fun. Our quiz givers had a lot of fun doing that. We registered about 88 students overall. That's a good day. I measure it as a success. The day was a success. Everything we planned happened, and students left there educated, and hopefully one less barrier out of their way, having registered to vote. Maybe they won't even go vote, but they're registered now if they decide to. So it went well. Thanks for asking. I felt really cool, really good to be a part of something. It was something that CSUN community got to do. It wasn't just me or Associated Students or my committee, but you really see the spirit of people on this campus, and I really love this campus. The student bodies are really.
Yeah, so Tyler, how do you feel about the Associated Students make an event like that and pushing young adults to vote or register to vote?
I think it's awesome. I can't commend them enough. The work that Tracy and others are doing in AS is fantastic, and that's exactly the kind of community outreach and service you need to provide in order to get more people involved in the process. So one of the most important barriers to voting is registration. And it seems like a pretty minor thing. In California it is, but we've purposely made registration a pretty low-cost endeavor in California. In other states it's much harder. So in California, if you get a driver's license or another government-issued ID, or you change your address, you're automatically registered to vote. Before, you could just check a box. You can do it online. Go online and vote right now, register to vote, whoever's watching right now. But in other states, like where I grew up in Kansas, you have to physically go down to the county clerk's office, fill out paperwork, turn it in, everything's sort of triple and double checked. It's a very costly thing. And once you are registered to vote, the percentage of Americans that vote are about 90% of those that are registered. In a good election year, about 60% of Americans vote. So the biggest hurdle, sort of thinking about those institutions that Tracy was talking about, is registering. 88 students may not sound like a lot, but if you gave away 500 burgers, we're talking about roughly 20% of the students. Hopefully a lot of them were already registered, so I think that's a fantastic number.
Okay. Tracy, so on to the next question. Do you think that politics intimidates young adults?
I got into studying politics because as a young adult, I was very angry about politics, and I started studying it, and it kind of helped turn it more into a passion. And so I think a lot of students, because then they understand, rather than being angry, why aren't they doing this? It's like, oh, okay, now I see why they are or are not doing that. And I think a lot of students are angry, but and intimidated for sure in the structure and the institutions, because it's a lack of political knowledge. Like that's something that could be overcome with some education. And I just hope that fear or that intimidation leads them to be interested, to get informed. I don't think that it's necessarily, if fear is faced properly, it keeps you alive. You look left when you cross the street because you're afraid you might get run over, right? So if this fear or this intimidation of politics makes them go, oh, I better pay attention, then maybe it's not a bad thing. And now if they hide in their shell, and that's another thing, it's how they respond to that fear.
How about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I think that there's some intimidation. There's also a lot of cynicism, which I think is perfectly natural. I was that way when I was 18. So I think there's some intimidation in that you aren't really sure where to get information about the election. You're not sure which information to trust because there's a lot of news sources that lean pretty far to the left or the right. You don't necessarily trust yourself that you know how to process that information. And more importantly, I think from a cynicism standpoint, is you, as a young person, and even as somebody who's a slightly less young person, you don't always feel like your voice is heard. And part of that is that a lot of the policies we talk about tend to affect older populations, predominantly older, whiter populations. Our politicians tend to be older, whiter, and male. They don't look like the campus at CSUN, for example. Congress is not a descriptive representative body in that way. So you feel like your voice isn't heard, and you ask yourself, why should I do this if none of it's going to matter? And that's a vicious cycle because the people who do turn out at high rates, the people who participate really in both presidential and midterm elections, like the one coming up, are older Americans, are predominantly white Americans. So it naturally feels like my voice isn't being heard, and they're making policies for this person because that's who politicians are focusing on because they can win elections. So if you don't like it, fix it, get out and vote, and make your voice heard, and that'll help. But it's hard to overcome that initial cynicism, I think.
Now, do you think that the current presidential administration might be, a little scary for young adults?
Yeah, not only young adults, but also other big parts of our population. Every day there are policies that we're not even focusing on that are happening at the bureaucratic level that are splitting up families, splitting up American families, violating people's rights on a regular basis, and things that are actually damaging people every day. And I think that has people scared, but it also has people pretty motivated. So in a midterm election like the one coming up, youth turnout, when I say youth, I mean like 18 to 29-year-olds, is usually pretty low, like between 15 and 25%. Overall turnout is pretty low, usually around 35 to 40%. So your voice you sort of have more bang for the buck when you go vote. I think this election is going to look a little bit different. The younger population seems more motivated, they seem more excited, they seem more angry, and that tends to bring people out to the ballot box.
How about you, Tracy? How do you feel about the current administration and young adults?
I definitely don't think that that's the candidate that reflects their generation. I mean, the young adults really, I would think, were disappointed. But I don't think Hillary did either. I think that Bernie was really the candidate for that demographic, and they came into this disappointed. Are they more disappointed in Trump than they are in Hillary? I would say so. But that's a speculation, I don't know. But I think that the disappointments start before even any of the policy happened. Even not even getting into the administration, how it has unfolded. I think that the young adults came in, they're disappointed with the system itself, with the way that it went in the Democratic convention, with the nomination, and then with the election. The popular vote went to Hillary, and the Electoral College went to Trump. I think so. Again, the institutions they've been disappointed in. But as far as with Trump, I mean, living in California, I want to say yes, they're definitely disappointed. But I mean, maybe in a state like Texas, the youth wouldn't be the same. So I haven't seen the numbers, so I can't speak for them.
Okay. So Tyler, the current presidential administration demonized the media, per se. What effects do you think that is on young voters? Do you think that young voters might not trust the media because of the things that the presidential administration might say?
I find a lot of the comments by the president and his supporters about fake news and about distrusting mainstream media disheartening from not necessarily a political standpoint, but again from somebody who sees their job as educating and empowering young people in the process. This is pretty damaging when you're telling them that the information they're getting is false, that elections are rigged, and all of those claims, by the way, are unequivocally incorrect. The New York Times is not fake news. The CNN is not fake news, although maybe it leans one way or the other. there is legitimately fake news that has influenced our election in the past and will try to influence our election again in the future. That's also scary. So now more than ever, we need to be supporting student journalism. We need to be subscribing to newspapers. By the way, I think you get an LA Times subscription if you get a Los Angeles library card, so go get one. You can get a New York Times subscription for $4 if you enter your .edu email address. And these long-form types of journalism are good, and we should get our information from a variety of sources. The vast majority of Americans get their news from one source and one source only. So they're watching MSNBC or they're watching Fox News, and you're not getting the full picture. And then it's made even worse when we have a president claiming that factual news is false, and that has me worried on a more existential level.
Interesting. So Tracy, how do you feel about that?
So repeat the question just to make sure that I stay on.
So the current administration is basically demonizing the media, relating to like fake news. What effect do you think it might be on young voters?
So the effect that I hope, and I agree with everything that Dr. Hughes said, it undermines the institution, it undermines the legitimacy, and planting that seed, that's terribly destructive potential. I hope, as far as how it would influence them, I hope that it's an opportunity to inspire them to learn. Because interpreting the media is something that everybody should learn how to do. If you can't just read one paper and make that be your source of information. The blog sources, the New York Times is a pretty, I can't say nonpartisan or central, but everybody has a slant to their thing, and you need to learn how to recognize it. You need to be willing to read articles from views that are not your own, and be able to maybe read 3 or 4 articles and take away what they all agree on, and kind of just recognize the bias and interpret these things for yourself. So I hope that this talk about fake news, unfortunately, I think it's just shut everybody off. Like either they believe it's fake news or they believe there's no such thing as fake news. But I would rather like to think that they took this opportunity to go, you know what, I need to learn how to be a better informed citizen and learn how to read the media properly. Because that's the center of how we become informed citizens. Because the media is very important. How else are we going to know these things? They lower the cost, again, of how we find out about these politicians and about the issues. But we need to be responsible on what we do, how we interpret it too. So it might be an opportunity to be better citizens when they recognize this.
So, Tracy, do you think that turnout might get better as you get older, or do you think that turnout varies generation to generation?
Well, in the last 30 years or so, I was reading something like back in 40 years, the variance has been about 10 percentage points, from 50 to 60, kind of in that zone.
Overall turnout.
Overall, is that what we were talking about, overall turnout, or just?
Yeah, overall turnout.
So overall turnout, the percentage of people who vote compared to how many people are old enough to vote, right, as opposed to who's eligible to vote. But I think it's going to vary because it was high when Obama ran, and it was low during Clinton's second term, because they weren't motivated to get out there, but they were motivated. And I think the next 2020 they will be motivated, and we'll see another high turnout. But I don't expect it to be over the 58 that Obama had, and I don't expect the percentage-wise to increase over that. No, that's just a normative opinion that's not based on any facts or empirical evidence, but.
I would add to that and say that yeah, overall turnout is pretty consistent. The 60s are a blip on the radar because the 60s were a special time in terms of engagement. But in terms of younger Americans not voting at higher rates, that's true of every generation. It was true of Xers, it was true of millennials, it's true of Generation Z, whatever we're calling you darn kids these days. My first election that I could ever vote in was 2008. That was a high water mark for 18 to 29-year-olds, but that dipped off pretty quickly. And now millennials are voting at the same rates that Xers were when they were their age. So the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. So when your parents tell you, oh, your kids aren't engaged, you look at you don't vote, like say, no, mom and dad, you also voted at the same rates that my generation did when you were younger. We had to get to your age before we saw that. So that's a pretty common trend across generations. And I would say if you don't like it, go vote, because your voice will matter, and especially in an election like the one coming up in November.
And I like when there's this generational thing, when we talk about Xers and millennials and the baby boomers, and there's this like blaming the other generation, and I dislike that, because as an Xer, we really were angry at the system. We really wanted to change things. We ran into barriers. The millennials are having the same issue now. They're running into barriers and they get discouraged and they're angry with the other things. But we need to all come together. Like the 3 or 4 generations together will change things. No one generation is going to do it, in my opinion.
Okay. Tyler, so some critics say that young voters have multiple jobs and might not have time to go out and vote. Do you feel like employers might see an increase in voter turnout if they give them time, time away from work, or do you feel like voters just need to find a way themselves to get out?
I think we need to reduce any of the costs and benefit, or any of the cost and barriers to voting that we can. So legally, you're required to give somebody, I think, an hour off of work, no matter what. But if you work in Woodland Hills and you're riding the bus from Pacoima, you need more than an hour to go vote, right? That's why we have great things in California like vote by mail, why some states have only vote by mail. Some states allow you more or less time away from work as well. Those are barriers that keep people from voting, and they keep a particular kind of person from voting, like younger people, lower income individuals have a harder time overcoming those. People who are older, have more money, have more resources, have more free time, can overcome those obstacles. So I think when we reduce those, things get a lot better in terms of giving people access to the ballot box. And California is one of the front runners doing that, and I'm glad I live in a state like that.
That's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank both of you for joining me. It was a really nice conversation.
Thank you.
You love their music. Why would you steal it? When you illegally download your favorite band's music, they might just disappear. Downloading music without paying for it is just not cool.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can also listen on KCSN 88.5 FM Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley TV at 5 on Sunday evenings and on LA 36 Thursday nights at 9:30. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Sandy Chavez.